Hello, brilliant entrepreneur. It's Tash Corbin here, and welcome to another episode of the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. This is episode number 334, which means you can find all the relevant links and show notes for today's episode over at tashcorbin.com/334. Today, I'm sharing with you my side hustle tips for busy people. So if you are starting a business on the side of a day job or other responsibilities, or if you have limited time to invest in growing your online business, I think you're going to find this one super helpful. So let's dive on in. I'm Tash Corbin, and this is the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. So there are lots of reasons why people choose to create an online business that's on the side of something else or in a very tight boundary time, whether it's rising cost of living and they need extra income on the side, or perhaps they want to start a business when they have started a family, they've got other obligations, or just wanting to create that financial security and not diving straight into the deep end of starting a business with no other income. It is a very, very appealing way to start a business because it means that you still have, in most cases, your other income source. And that can be really important, particularly for women and non-binary folk, because of the need to ensure security of living arrangements for family or being able to keep a roof over your head. So we have seen a huge influx of people starting what is affectionately referred to as a side hustle. But even if it's not on the side of a job, this podcast episode is about creating business growth in a very limited time. So whether it's on the side of a job or you simply need to keep your business in a very limited time frame, then I think you'll find these tips and strategies really helpful. So my top tips, and I have 5 of them for you today, start with number 1, being really clear on what is a high return action for you in your business. And even with deciding on the model of business that you're going to use for your side hustle, whether it be selling in the high ticket area or selling products or selling digital products, there's lots of different models. Some of them require more of your time than others per dollar that you earn. And also the actions that you complete in that business, some of them have a high likelihood of return or are high return actions, and others, to be frank, are just keeping you busy and they're not actually creating the kind of growth that you may need in order to see a good financial return for the time that you're putting into your business. So when it comes to creating a side hustle or growing a business in a limited time, more than ever, you're going to need to be very discerning about what you choose to put your time into. So whilst it might be great advice to spend hours and hours creating lots of free content for someone who's starting a business full time, if you're starting a side hustle, then content creation, and in particular, the types of model of content business that require hours and hours of content creation may not be the right fit for you. So be discerning about which activities that you're going to undertake and learn to interpret and understand and learn to measure the return on the activities that you do so that you can refine what you're investing time into to ensure that it's high return activities. Tip number 2 is to remember that audience does not equal income. And yes, in the age of influencers and being paid for access to your audience, it can be very easy to believe that the best way to grow income is to grow your audience. However, that is actually one of the slowest business models to bring to fruition compared to other options. And we always get rolled out the exception cases rather than the rule. For every one influencer who went to 20,000 followers in 5 months, there are thousands more who are still only under 100 followers or under 1,000 followers on Instagram. And so whilst the people that we have the most visibility of, the ones we see the most of, are the ones who grew an audience really quickly and have been able to monetize that audience really quickly, remember that they are the exception, not the rule. And there are other models of business and audience growth that have far higher chance of success and likeliness of creating profit and income quickly. And so you don't always have to follow the models of the most visible side hustlers. When it comes to building a side hustle and deciding on your model and the way that you grow your audience, it's very easy for us to believe that the ones that we see the most are the most successful. But I have personally worked with a bunch of people who created very low time cost businesses and have very tiny audiences, but they're making thousands and thousands a week because they've chosen a high return model. They're not chasing audience, they're chasing income. And those two things aren't as linked as we assume they are. So that's tip number 2. Remember that audience does not necessarily equal income and that not all audiences are created equal. Number 3, it can be easy to have the mindset that you've got it harder because you've got less time. So tip number 3 is pay attention to your mindset about being a side hustler or having limited time, because it's actually a choice of interpretation. And some of the most successful online business owners that I've worked with in startup have been the ones who've had limited time, and therefore they've been very savvy with their use of time. They've been very savvy about how they structure their day, what activities they put their time into. So they've been far more successful, far more quickly. So you can actually turn that belief around and realize that having these strict time boundaries can actually be an advantage when you have the right strategy and you use that to your advantage as much as possible. So yes, if you're going to be faffing around doing all the things that every guru on the internet has told you you might need to do, then you will find it difficult to achieve the same results as that guru who may have put 60-hour work weeks in when they first started their business. Whereas if you see your boundaried time as an advantage, and particularly as an advantage because it's going to make you more discerning about what strategies you use and what strategies you don't, then you may actually just find that you create a very efficient and lean business. And that's a good thing. You know, I started my business full time. I jumped straight into having my business. I quit my job. We relied on my partner's income only, and I was full time in my business. But when I look at what I did, especially in the first 4 to 5 months of my business, 90% of it was unnecessary because I had the time to sit there and do it. And what I realized quite quickly when I first started my business was that I defaulted to 60-hour work weeks because that's just the mindset I had of what was required. I followed a lot of influencers and content creators who had, you know, those inspirational quotes that would say, you know, work hard now so that you can have the things later that people who didn't work hard can't have. And, you know, all those sorts of things. I totally butchered that saying. But you know what I mean? Like work hard the way that other people won't now so that you can have what they won't have later. Something like that. Anyway, so I followed a lot of people who really did glorify being busy, getting up early, working hard. And I had a bit of an awakening a few months in because I realized like one of my core reasons why I started my online business was to stop working 60-hour work weeks. And the only person who could decide how long my work week was me. And so at about the 4 to 5 month mark in my business, I was down to 30-hour work weeks, and that felt really good for me. And actually that boundary forced me to be discerning about what tasks I was doing in my business. And it also allowed me to give tasks to my assistant far more effectively because what I realized was that I hired an assistant from the start because I wanted to just practice delegating to someone. And back then, having a virtual assistant was pretty new back in my day, 10 years ago when I started my business. And so I actually hired someone very early for just a few hours a week when I first started my business, but I wasn't giving them anything of substance to do in my business. I was lumping everything on myself. So when I started to create those boundaries around how much time I would give to the business, it meant that there were things I couldn't do in that time. And so it actually then almost forced my hand to give more meaningful tasks to my assistant, which meant I was still paying them the exact same amount, but I was getting far more return for the investment that I was spending. And I was spending like under $100 a month on my assistant when I first started. So it was a very small investment when I first started, but I knew that I wanted to have a team when I started my business. So I started out as I meant to go on, and I hired an assistant very early. And that brings me to tip number 4. When you're starting a business on the side or you have limited time, you need to hire sooner. So hire sooner rather than later. Yes, you're starting a business to make extra money, or you're wanting to, have that extra take home amount. And so profitability is important, but when you hire sooner rather than later in your business, you actually also increase income. And so if you see your hire as creating more leverage in your income, then hopefully that will help overcome some of that resistance. I 100% recommend hiring someone into your business, even if it's a virtual assistant for 5 hours a week. It can be as small in terms of their time as you like, but it does allow you to start thinking like a CEO, operating like a CEO, and it gets you discerning around what is a good use of my time and what could someone else be doing. And with things like Upwork and Fiverr and all of those platforms that allow us direct access to hire really amazing assistants at a very reasonable rate, I think that there's no excuse for continuing to bootstrap it on your own, especially when your time is limited. If you've got lots of time and there's not enough tasks to fill that time, sure, go ahead and continue doing everything yourself. But when we have so much accessibility, it's so much easier to work with people overseas now. It's so much more cost effective. Like, there's so many reasons why I recommend hiring sooner rather than later. Now, before anyone comes at me about, making use of cheap labor from overseas or anything along those lines, I always ensure that when I hire people from overseas, I am paying them far more than the average living wage in their country, especially when it comes to hourly rates. And some of my best team members and my longest standing team members have been overseas hire, and because of the work that they do for me, they have been able to allow their partner to not have to go and work. They have been able to buy a home that wouldn't be available to them if they didn't work for someone overseas. They have been able to have children. I have a team member who's adopted children. Like, all of those things were created because of the wage that I paid that person. And I'm not someone who exploits people from overseas. I pay really well, but that doesn't mean I'm paying $55, $65 an hour for someone to schedule posts to social media. So I totally understand the desire to ensure that you're not taking advantage of people from lower income areas of the world, or areas where cheap labor is exploited. But I once hired an assistant who previously had worked in a sewing factory, and she worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, and she earned 3 times as much working for me 10 hours a week in a virtual assistant role, and ended up getting 3 more clients because of my recommendation of her. And so she was able to buy a house and free herself from what was exploitative labor in her own home country. And so I highly recommend that you check out some of those options to hire people through Upwork or Fiverr or any of those types of ones. I prefer direct access rather than agency. There are some cases in which working through an agency is a better model. The thing I didn't like about the agency model was there was no openness about how much the actual person was being paid, and I wanted to have that visibility of how much they were being paid. And I can attribute a lot of my business growth to the fact that I had team members. And the more money that you make in your business, the more you can share those financial wins. And one of my favorite things to do with my team is give them a pay rise or pay them a bonus. And I get to do that because of the team and the role that they play in my business growth. So tip number 4 is hire sooner rather than later. And then tip number 5, and this is a little bit of a warning one, is be careful who you learn from. Because whilst there's a lot of coaches and mentors and gurus and marketing experts and influencers out there who will promise to teach you how to start your business and how to grow your business, and a lot of the time they will say, as a side hustle or in very limited time, they actually, in reality, the strategies that they're teaching require 30 to 40 hours a week of your time and energy in order to implement them. And we've had quite a lot of conversations in the Heart-Centered Soul-Driven Entrepreneurs group and also inside some of my programs in the last year about some of the advice and some of the role modeling that happens online from influencers and people who say they have side hustles, where when they share what their day's agenda is, they're either working their job and then doing 8 to 10 hours of extra work a day, and therefore getting very little sleep and having no life outside of their job and their side hustle. Or they say that they're doing it in limited hours of time, but when you look at the reality of the load of content that they've created, the amount of time that they're physically online and present with their audience, the schedules that they talk about that they've got for the day, then when you start doing the math, they are still putting 40 to 50 hour work weeks in, even though they're claiming that it's part-time. And so, be discerning about who you're taking advice from. A lot of the time, people built an audience in a side hustle or in a content marketing kind of model back when audiences were easier to get their attention. I once went to a conference about blogging, and they talked about, having, the speakers were talking about having very profitable blogs and, creating amazing audiences and all these brilliant results. But they all shared very openly numbers from when they first started. And often it was 5 to 10 years of blogging consistently several times a week before they ever got to the point where they were making a living wage from that content. And similarly, we see nowadays there's far more competition for the content space. And so a lot of those models of business that require 10,000 plus audiences, 30,000 plus audiences, sometimes 100,000 plus audiences, in order for you to have some monetization and profitability, the people who got there 5 or 6 years ago didn't have as much competition as there is now. And so their strategies just aren't as effective anymore. I still have under 10,000 followers on my Facebook and under 5,000 followers on my Instagram, but I am a multi-six-figure business owner. I'm not relying on giant audience numbers in order to be able to monetize. So there are a lot of different models that are available to you, especially when it comes to side hustle and time-limited businesses. And some will be more profitable than others, and some require far bigger audiences than others. So be mindful of who you're taking advice from and who you're learning from, because if their model of monetization requires tens of thousands of followers and they don't have up-to-date, very effective ways of growing that audience, and please don't come at me and tell me that Instagram Reels is a way of doing that very quickly and that it's totally easy, because it's not as easy as they make it out to be, right? So if they don't have really clear and effective strategies that work now to grow significant audiences, then how on earth are they going to teach you how to do that for your own business? I understand that, Reels and TikTok are high reach strategies for business, but I still see, as I said, that the person who uses that strategy to create an audience and it results in profitability and lots of sales for their business are still the exception, not the rule. Whereas some other models of business have a higher chance of success. They don't rely on the perfect Bermuda Triangle of opportunity and luck and going viral because of some random person sharing it. And instead, they have far more chance of success using strategies that you actually have control of, not waiting for someone to pick you or waiting for a random audience to take it off and go viral. And, even with clients of mine who have had content go viral, that viral content has not contributed as much to the bottom line of their business as other much smaller audience strategies that are far higher conversion. So they are my 5 top tips for you for side hustle success, or anyone who's working to very limited time to grow their business. And if you are someone who's wanting to grow a business on the side of something or as a side hustle, I actually have a really cool freebie for you today. And that is my upcoming workshop called Side Hustle Success. So head on over to the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/334. And in the show notes of today's episode, you'll find the link to go and register for Side Hustle Success. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the Heart Centered Business Podcast. And until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Bye for now. Would you like more tips, tools, and resources to help you grow your heart-centered business? Head to tashcorbin.com today.